Let's start. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to a beautiful spring afternoon. I wrote this yesterday, so obviously not the case today, but we're spring nonetheless. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to I'm Ramon Cruz. I'm visiting professor at the School of Public and International Affairs, focusing on environmental policy and climate justice. And it is a pleasure here to welcome a friend and colleague, Dana Johnson, to C-PREE's Bradford series, and to Princeton. As you know, these halls usually bring many academics to talk to us, but it is not often that we interact with people that are in the front line of advocacy and activism. And so that's why it's very exciting to be here today. Dana is the Senior Director for Strategy and Federal Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We Act is a leading organization in the environmental justice movement for over 3 decades. And while We Act still does very local work in West Harlem, organizing the community against air pollution, justice, gentrification, and all sorts of contamination, it is also a very active voice in the national level, in Washington, D.C., and internationally as well, being a voice for environmental justice and vulnerable communities worldwide and in the process around the Paris Agreement. Peggy Shepard, for example, who is We Act founder and Dana's boss, is the chair of President Biden's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And at We Act, Dana leads the organization's work to build power and grow capacity for federal climate and environmental justice action. During her tenure at We Act, Dana has conceptualized and served as the primary driver of national advocacy and policy-setting efforts, such as the Dirty Deal permitting fight, Justice Forward funding initiative, the Clean Air for the Long Haul Cohort regulatory campaign, and the Wrong Direction energy policy storytelling project that advances equity in federal decision making. Prior to this, to her current role, Dana served in nonprofit leadership roles at YMCA's in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and also in communication firms. Her educational background is in marketing and business administration at Roosevelt University in Chicago, and she's in the board of a number of organizations, several government advisory council. She often lectures on EJ issues, but most importantly, she's a very strong voice for climate justice. I have seen her in action, telling the truth to senators, Congress members, high-level advisors at the White House, and she's fearless. So, Dana, it is a pleasure to have you at Princeton. Thank you.
Always whenever my bio is being read, I'm like, who is that? But really grateful to have the opportunity to be here with you all today. So as Ramon mentioned, We Act for Environmental Justice was founded in 1998 in northern Manhattan by our now executive director, Peggy Shepard, along with Chuck Sutton and Vernice Miller-Travis, who is still on our board. And our origin story really came out of the pushback against the siting of a sewage treatment plant in Harlem, in northern Manhattan, that actually was slated to go into the Chelsea community, if you think about like equitable distribution of some of these polluting sources. But a lack of political will and quite frankly, race determined that sewage treatment plant would go in our northern Manhattan community, and with it came, all of the pollution burden, nuisance burden when you think about smell and other issues. And so Peggy, Vernice, and Chuck organized community, frankly, for 5 years for free to push back against that as well as the siting of bus depots. I believe 6 of the 7 bus depots that served New York were in our community, as well as some other polluting facility. And so they were really focused on, how could we ensure a better quality of life for the residents of Northern Manhattan, and thus We Act for Environmental Justice was born. So when you think about our theory of change, it really is about redistributing power. And our mission is to ensure that people living in a community of color and living in an area of low income, sometimes those can be the same things, but oftentimes they aren't. We know that race is the #1 indicator of if you will live in a community that is experiencing environmental injustice. And so we want to make sure that people are at the decision-making table when it comes to deciding policies as well as practices. And I always like to add money into that, and that we see a lot of money coming out of the federal government right now through key legislation. So we do our work in 2 ways. We have 2 pillars. One is to unlock opportunities at the city and state level for the residents of New York. I'll say we also do it at the federal level. We organize at all 3 levels of government, but we also do it at the federal or the national level. We Act is the only environmental justice org with a permanent presence. Now, there are people who come in and out, but in terms of having an actual address, we are the only environmental justice organization based in Washington, D.C. We've had a federal policy office for a little over 10 years. And some of the way that we do our national advocacy work is through a network called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. It's about 50 EJ groups. They represent 22 states or so, and we try to make a federal connection to the work that those groups are doing on the ground as well. And this really is the point that I want to make with this is we have 10 to 13 focus areas that we work in. And this really is to demonstrate that there is an intersectional element to environmental justice. It's very difficult for us to be pursuing energy and climate justice, healthy homes, clean air, even affordable transit in isolation. We tend to think holistically about how to solve a problem. I think building electrification, for example, is one of those areas where it's not just about, can we put induction appliances in public and affordable housing? That's our sweet spot. But it really is thinking about what's the quality of the home? Have we, if it's public housing, what has HUD's investment looked like in that? Do we need to bring the buildings up to spec? How do we remediate toxins? How do we engage in weatherization? What do we do if we electrify a community and the power goes out and people have, health issues that might, be required on having electricity? We don't always, or we're learning to, let me say that. We are learning to not take on the entire problem, but to figure out our part in the solution. But we do spend a lot of time thinking holistically about the problem that we're trying to solve and the solutions that are being advanced. And just wanted to talk a little bit about our team. So when I started at React in 2019, I think it was, we had 15, 16 people in the entire organization, 2 of us in the federal policy office. In the past 3 years, our federal policy team has grown to be 12 people. It's called for us to have legal expertise. So we have an individual who can support intervening in spaces like FERC. We have a research component because I was tired of going into meetings and having models be presented, and I would ask a question about, a regional implication of what was presented. Or, sometimes I would be like, can you get on my block and tell me what this particular set of data points you are sharing means. And no one would be able to do it. And so we needed to have our own research, at least as a counter, as a vetter of what was being presented to us. We have policy experts who go from, beauty justice work, toxic work, all the way to, energy policy. And then we do have a comms team that works in support of the work we do at the federal level, as well as being a supporter of the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which I mentioned. All right, so today's conversation is about the federal investments and a key initiative in the Biden-Harris administration called Justice 40. But before we get to it, I wanted to just uplift the environment that we were operating in. So when I joined WEACT in 2019, it was during the Trump administration, and we were in a defensive posture. If you just looked at environmental policy, 112 policies have been impacted by that administration. 98 of them have been rolled back. 12 of them were in progress. We were in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we, saw this increase in morbidity and mortality rates when it came to people living in communities of color. And there were studies that were coming out. One of note came out of Harvard that found there was a correlation between living in a community where you were exposed to pollution for long periods of time and death rates from COVID-19. And then also we were in the season of watching a man be murdered. We watched George Floyd be murdered. And it was, I think I saw a couple of statistics that that found that like that first week, so between May 25th and June 5th, there were more than 1 billion views of videos of racial injustice. In the first 12 hours, you saw more than 2 million people watch that video. So it was a part of us. It was tangible. It was resting on our shoulders. And quite frankly, it was a scary time. We didn't know what was going to happen. But one of the byproducts of the convergence of all of that was environmental justice was centered in the presidential campaign. It became a part of the election, and it quite frankly became a part of the then candidate Biden's agenda. And so it catapulted, groups like WEACT and the environmental justice movement. The 30 years of work that people had been doing was center stage. And we found ourselves, that's why our team grew, we found ourselves having like people as policy. So we were making recommendations on who should be FERC commissioners, who should lead departments and agencies. We found ourselves having to come up with policy solutions. How do we want to reduce emissions in communities? We found ourselves thinking about not even just federal policy, but even local policies. How can we ensure that these policies are implemented on the ground in equitable and just ways? How could we even be coaches, supporters, recommenders to people in federal agencies who were responsible for programs to think about them in new ways? It couldn't be business as usual if we were going to impact communities. And we found ourselves in a dynamic of having the House and having the Senate on paper, but not having the Senate in terms of the way that policy or legislation was being decided. And so we were at not a stalemate, but we were stuck. Let's use that. We were stuck in trying to figure out how we could get policy passed in a way that would benefit communities, that would take advantage of this moment. And so that's how we found ourselves in an appropriations process. So some of the first things that President Biden did was to start rolling back some of those 100 plus actions that happened during the Trump administration. I'm just focused on the ones that were in the environmental space, but it was across all categories of life. On January 21st, he signed an executive order that brought that political agenda, that candidate agenda to life within the federal government, Executive Order 14008 specifically. And it looked at how can we leverage this moment to transition our energy economy in a way that helps us to meet the climate goals that we set at international levels, but also address legacy harms that were experienced in communities, and set people up for economic prosperity. And the way that he attempted to do it, the agenda was called the Build Back Better agenda. It essentially was a clean energy standard that we couldn't get passed because we didn't have the votes to be able to do it. So we ended up pursuing two appropriation bills. One was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Inflation Investment Jobs Act. I can never remember all the acronyms, which to me was like the more hard part of transforming the country, was like investment in infrastructure. And then we also saw the Inflation Reduction Act, which was designed to be like the softer side of, I think, policy making. So how do we address like the social issues? How do we address things like housing? How do we address the workforce, education, et cetera, in service to this transition that we wanted to see take place in our country? In order to get some of this work done, as Ramon or Professor Cruz mentioned, the administration established the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It's made up of 26 advocates from across the country, including our co-founder and executive director, Peggy Shepard, who is one of the co-chairs. And they were given a body of work to look at facets of this transition that the administration wanted to make, and to provide recommendations on doing that. It is a federal advisory committee, and there is, I think, sometimes a disconnect in expectations, because people spend a lot of time and energy in putting robust recommendations together, and they wanted to know what would happen with them. You know, how would they be used? How would they be implemented? And with the FACA, it is you give us the information and we move on. So we saw a lot of tension in the first couple of years related to people's expectations. And one of the other things that we'll talk about today that came out of that was the Justice 40 Initiative, which was the administration's whole of government approach to embedding environmental justice in the way that the federal government operates. So it said that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments would be reinvested in communities that experience legacy harms. Now, benefits was a problematic word for us because that's ambiguous. We wanted benefits to be actual dollars. And that's what a lot of our advocacy was around. How do we get 40% of dollars invested in communities? It leveraged hundreds of federal programs to ensure that disadvantaged communities received scratch-out benefits investments from the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the American Rescue Plan. Federal programs was another area with a little bit of contention, because you had programs operating in the federal government that were inherently equity programs. So if you think about like LIHEAP, like the Low Income Heat Assistance Program, that's inherently going to communities that are disadvantaged and doesn't necessarily transform or revolutionize how we appropriate and actually send resources into communities. Like, people wanted to see new programs. They wanted to see new investments. So that first set of covered programs that came out of the federal government were a little bit tricky. And then the third part of it was the use of the climate and economic justice screening tool, which was a mapping tool that had about 8 indicators in it that was used to, or is being used to determine where federal investments would go. And if you'll remember in the beginning, I noted that environmental justice or injustice is inherently a race-based issue. But this tool did not include race in it for political reasons, which are like understandable. We have a Supreme Court that people were concerned about exposing any race-based policy and setting a precedent that we would not be able to, that we would have to contend with for a long time. People worried about that particular impact on the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so the federal government made a decision to exclude race, which again, put it in contention with communities. How do you exclude race from solving a problem that is based on race? And so there are these 8 proxies, if you will, that look at education, it looks at economic status, it looks at public health data, a couple of other indicators to determine where money would go. And so we did some work, I'll get to that a little bit later, but this CJEST tool was a big deal, especially when you have places like New York State through its its climate leadership, I can never remember the acronym as I look at you. I just know it's CLCPA, y'all, sorry, you gotta look it up. That included race in its federal environment, its state level environmental justice legislation. And so you have people looking at places like New York wanting the federal government to be that bold and to be that ambitious. And I think I was sharing with someone earlier today that, a lot of the sentiment was we may lose the fight, but we wanted to see the federal government, the Department of Justice, be really bold in pursuing that particular indicator, which didn't end up in the tool, but that is another one of those points that I want to raise. So I want to just really quickly show a video for how we decided to take the Justice 40 initiative that the president introduced and bring it to communities. And we had, let me just play the video. I'm just going to roll it back here like. Oh, there we go.
Everyone deserves a healthy life, a thriving community, and a future free from environmental harms. For generations, communities of color and low-income families have historically been harmed by disinvestment and overburdened by pollution. The Justice 40 initiative commits 40% of federal investments to cleaner air, cleaner water, green energy solutions, and economic opportunities. We need our leaders to stand up and ensure that all Justice 40 investments reach us quickly and help nurture a prosperous and equitable way forward for everyone.
All right. So between the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we have, more than $1 trillion coming out of the federal government and going into communities. And we had major concerns about what that would mean for people who, in theory, that money was designed for. So We Act was among several EJ groups that received funding from the Bezos Earth Fund to raise awareness of the Justice 40 initiative. And we took our money and put together a program that had 3 parts to it. The first part was to build awareness. The second part was to ensure equitable implementation on the ground. And the third part was to, as best we could, partner with the federal government to ensure that the design of the programs and initiatives had as much equity and justice embedded in them as possible. So our first effort was around building awareness. And so we put together a campaign called What is Justice 40? And it included I think we did, and you can look this up, we got $6 million. So I think this first effort we did like a $500,000 ad buy, like a digital ad campaign that we sought to like just explain to people what the Justice 40 initiative is. $500,000 is not a lot of money in the ad world. So we went back to that EJ forum that we work with, those 22 states, and we tried to surround the communities of those EJ groups with information about what this initiative is. We launched a media campaign designed to explain what it is, and we were fortunate to get Ali Zaidi from the Climate Policy Office to participate in that with us. We had Jalan Newsom-White, who is leading environmental justice within the Center for Environmental Quality. We had Senator Markey, and then we had EJ groups participating in this effort to help try to tell local stories, but also try to talk about what the federal government was doing. We, from our media efforts, in that first, I think 4 months, we had 62 articles that appeared across the country, some of them even in Spanish. We put together like toolkits that other groups could download if they wanted to explain what the Justice 40 initiative was to their community. Just a whole brand awareness effort. And a year later, y'all, Data for Progress came out with a study that looked at how much awareness people had of the Justice 40 initiative. And after a year, 85% of all likely voters that they surveyed knew nothing. If you looked at it by party, the numbers were still high. When people understood what the Justice 40 initiative was, you saw a lot of support for the effort. People thought it was a good thing. When you talked to them about who they trusted, they had more trust in their city and state government. So it became clear to us that we needed to get out of Washington, D.C. To stay in Washington, D.C. was not going to be helpful. And so we launched what we call the Justice Forward Tour. And it was a part of our second objective, which is local implementation, where we asked federal officials at agencies and departments from FEMA to Department of Defense. We had DOE, EPA, HUD. I think we probably had about 12 different agencies and departments over the course of the tour. We asked them to join us in communities, and we asked communities to invite their city and state officials, as well as others that they were working with, to come together to learn about the Justice 40 initiative together, but more importantly, to learn about the investments that could help solve some of the problems that they were having on the ground, that they already had solutions for. So these tours, we went to 8 cities. We went to Houston, Austin, Chicago, Detroit, Seattle. We went to New York, where we are. We went to Kansas City. Yeah, that's the 8. We did a virtual one with Senator Markey for legislators in Massachusetts. And we did 2 with Senator Schumer, 2 virtual ones for New York. And it was powerful. It was a powerful experience. You had people, the tours consisted of a toxic tour. So people got to go around to see the issues that people were experiencing on the ground. Some people had never even been in a community to know what that was like. So when you're designing programs, if you have no awareness of barriers on the ground, they are intellectual exercises as opposed to based off of people's real experience. And I'll give you an example. We went to 2 communities that were unincorporated. One of them, the only entity on the ground that could accept federal dollars was the school. So if you're talking about building a road or housing or, setting up solar farms, you'd have to figure out a way to do that through the school system. They wanted to build a road, and I'll just say it's Austin. The only way that, right outside of Austin, the only way they got a road built was because they made a deal with Tesla, which was setting up a factory, and Tesla built the road. So those are some of the conditions that exist in communities that people are just not aware of in Washington, D.C., myself included. Peggy will say to us all the time, EJ in New York is very different across the country, and what we do in Washington, D.C. is powerful, but you need to see what people are experiencing on the ground if you are going to make a difference. So we had toxic tours. People put together community solutions. So they had, summaries of all of the initiatives that they were trying to drive forward. And all of these were presented while we were on the toxic tour. And then we came back to have conversations. And it was like real time where you had somebody from the Department of Energy saying, well, I have money in this program that can support this effort. Or somebody from, HUD saying, well, I have money to plant trees that can address this particular problem. And it was real time ideation and beautiful work being done. And so at one of them we had, Congressman McCleaver was in Kansas City. We had the mayor actually at that one, along with community groups. And this is like, Austin. We had Matt Tejeda from the EPA before he left to go to NRDC. We had Department of Energy. And it was really, powerful experience, which made the work feel heavy, quite frankly. People had amazing ideas for what they wanted to get done. And we had a finite amount of money that we had to be able to invest in them to be able to move some of this work forward. So we decided that we would set up pilot cities. And I think that we were quite aggressive in doing this, where we thought we could pick 5 or 6 cities, invest in them for 2 years to bring one of the ideas, one of the shovel-worthy ideas. And we make the distinction between worthy and ready, because communities don't want all of the projects that are ready for investment. And that we pick a red state, a blue state, a red city in a blue state, a blue city in a red state, that just so that we could build case studies to show the variety of situations that people might be operating in. I think that was a little bit ambitious, as we saw, because not all of the groups were, if you think about like a product life cycle, while groups may have been doing work for years, for decades, in some ways they were still like in the growth phase. In the startup phase. They weren't necessarily in the growth phase. They didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the infrastructure internally. And we also saw that in cities. We saw cities that weren't pursuing the monies because they didn't have the people to do it, or their financial condition didn't have them in a position to say, if you had to have a matching percentage in order to access a grant, they didn't have that, or they didn't have the proper bond rating. So the conditions in communities are in a really tough place. Okay, I'm running out of time. I saw it. I won't show my video. Okay.
Leave space for
I knew this was going to happen to me, and I tried to practice. So I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of things so we have time for questions. So in terms of like where we are right now, we do have the pilot city set up. We did it in Chicago, Denver, and Kansas City. I think that this is a learning opportunity for us. Those things that I mentioned, we wanted groups to produce. There was just some baseline infrastructure work that we needed to do with them in order to move those kinds of the project forward in the way that we wanted. So right now we're starting to rethink how we can move the pilot cities forward for the rest of the year and maybe even expand it. We do plan to host a convening that we're calling Tales from the Road, and we want to showcase what we learned in terms of the great work that groups are doing, but also obstacles, because we believe that there are people, there are organizations out there that can help solve the problem. So if there is a solution, for example, of an unincorporated area and some legal team wants to jump in on that, we want to make that known so that people can do it. If there's a research need and there is a research entity that wants to take that project on, we want them to be aware of it and do it. And so we do see 5 areas. We see a role for philanthropy, even in that public and private partnerships, community solutions, legal, and research. And so we're trying to do that in July, and I'm happy to follow up with that information. And then I'll just end it with the 5 lessons I feel like we learned in the last year and a half, 2 years of doing this work. That communities already have the answers. They already know what they need. They've thought through it. And I think that the larger opportunity is for us to rethink how we hold expertise and who has it as we work to solve some of these problems. It's very difficult for us to move at the speed of trust because our politics don't support it. As I showed you in that Data for Progress poll, we're still in the building awareness phase. We aren't in the phase where we're able to fully match dollars with programs and initiatives. And because I think I was laughing with someone earlier, the federal government is literally pushing money out of the door because of the concerns around the outcome of the November election and not wanting to have that money be retracted. And so when we're pushing money out the door, it doesn't always get to the people who actually need it. Communities and governments can't seize the moment if they don't have capacity. I do think that that's an opportunity for philanthropy, and we right now starting to see an investment in governments as well as communities. We need to see a lot more of that. It's really difficult for us to solve problems of race or racism if we ignore race. That's a larger cultural, societal issue in this country that we just need to come to terms with. It's a long game. So I mentioned we got $6 million. None of the EJ groups and we re-granted a third of that, let me say that. But none of the EJ groups that got money, or any group for that matter, received additional investment. And so it really just felt like we pulled the scab off and then we're like, here's a Band-Aid and just go. When this work really requires a long-term effort. I do think that there is a role for research and legal centers in this work. Communities are looking for partners, but they don't want people to come to them and say, I have this wonderful dissertation that I'd like to include you on. They want you to sit down with them and have them talk to you about the problem that they're trying to solve and for there to be a co-created solution to get to it. And communities really need the federal government to deploy its convening power on the ground. They need people to come out of Washington, D.C. and sit at local tables with local governments, with industry, and work to come up with solutions to some of these problems. That is oh no, that's not my alarm. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dana. So
Thank you.
let's open it up to questions. All right. So we have here and then Denise, right?
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you, the 40% part of Justice 40, have we seen, at the federal level, are we closer to 40% than we were before? Are there dramatic changes in programs in where money is going? Have you seen that, at a programmatic or nationwide level?
Right. So I think, one, because it's a federal budget, it's not published. The spending is not published. So we would be counting on agencies and departments to report what they've done. And people have made recommendations around how that should happen. And trying to do that through like the Environmental Justice Scorecard, which is a part of the Executive Order 14008. I think also, like when I talked about like inherent equity programs shouldn't be counted in that 40%. I also think it should be 40% of the operating budget of an agency and department and not necessarily 40% of programs that have been deemed to be a covered program. So that was a really long way of saying no. But I do know before we had the midterm elections, there was a bill in oversight and reform that looked to have that kind of reporting be done, that kind of documenting and reporting. That's off track now because the House is now Republican led. As of today, somebody might have quit since
Many
we've been
people
here.
have lectures and classes and stuff.
Yes.
That's why don't feel offended. That
Yes.
People are, Professor Masra.
Yes.
Hi, really interesting and important work.
Thank you.
Very important. I'm just wondering if VIAC is involved in campaigning, because obviously this upcoming election is going to be absolutely critical for your goals.
Yes. So we do have a C4. Right now, it's only slated for work in New York City and New York State in terms of like candidate work. At the federal level, we use the C4 only for issues. And so when it comes to like local New York City, New York State work, there is campaign work happening. We just aren't doing it at the federal level.
Would you consider trying to get that permission is for swing states like Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of environmental justice issues and I mean a critical opportunity?
Yeah. Here's the other challenge that we have. Environmental justice is inherently like place-based and intimate. And so even when we did the Justice Forward tour, we did have to deal with the dynamic of being a New York or a Washington, D.C. based organization that's trying to do, work in one of these states. So we really would have to partner with someone on the ground to be able to do that. And it probably wouldn't be in our name.
Hi, I'm not even Riley. I am a professor here in politics and finance. And I do research on international affairs and recently some research on Black attitudes towards different international issues.
Yes.
And if you look at like polling over time, it's really interesting. You see across a number of different eras, basically, Black support for the U.S. support of like international environmental issues is higher than white support. And so I wonder in the work that you've been doing more recently, if you see local communities paying attention to things like whether or not the U.S. is part of the Paris Climate Accords or any sort of international initiative, just because that's the type of thing that I look into and I'm curious about your sort of on the ground vantage point.
Yeah, I can't say that I see that come up in our work a lot. I think that if people have a background or family connection to the diaspora, you see it a little bit more, but not necessarily in our everyday work. Frankly, it's work to even have people understand what environmental justice is and the connection to the quality of life that they're experiencing is, I think, an education effort. But if you look at polling around Black Americans, African Americans, around like public health or environmental or economic or energy issues, you will find that we are leading in wanting to see solutions to those things.
On energy issues, you mean like
Clean energy, affordability, transition in terms of addressing like the climate crisis. Yeah, you will see that.
Earlier you talked about one of the challenges often dealing with policy folks about this perspective of environmental justice as an intellectual exercise. I'm wondering what kind of major disconnects do you find between folks that are thinking about it as an intellectual exercise versus environmental justice as a lived experience?
Right, so let's look at the EPA rulemaking process, for example, around under the Clean Air Act, the carbon rule proposal for the power sector. So how do we address emissions coming from existing and new power sources? And the proposal out of the EPA is that we have either a hydrogen option. Currently, the proposal is a hydrogen option or a carbon capture utilization, maybe, and storage option, but definitely carbon capture and storage. That is an intellectual exercise happening in Washington, D.C. One, we have had $5 billion invested in demonstration projects out of the DOE that have failed. So we don't have any efficacy for this. We have not considered the safety parameters around it. Communities repeatedly say that they don't want it. Taxpayer dollars are going into investing in these when people are asking for taxpayer dollars to be invested in different ways. And yet in Washington, D.C., this is something that we are moving forward with. When you look at what people on the ground are wanting, they're saying, I don't want any of that. I would rather have, like, I'm advocating for like a renewable energy portfolio standard. I'm advocating for investments in community-based solar. I'm advocating for you to actually oversee the plants and ensure that they comply with existing standards. So there is this disconnect, and that's where the modeling comes in. The models say that you'll see a 90% reduction in emissions, and it's fiction. Where does that come from? You can add a bunch of assumptions into your models, but I was even saying to Keely earlier today, like, we don't even take like the political realities on the ground into consideration. So if you have some place like Wyoming that says it's coal for life, I don't care what you do at the federal level. We're gonna run this coal plant until we just can't. If you believe in Jesus, he's gonna come back before we stop using this coal. And you expect for us to believe that the people in that community, the industry in that community, is going to stop operating because of your perceived pressure? No, these are intellectual exercises that aren't taking into account what's happening on the ground. I was even saying, like, even with carbon capture, because of the nature of it, what happens if we have an emergency? Are our first responders prepared for that? If we store it, how are we ensuring that it doesn't contaminate our groundwater? If we're transporting it, the Department of Transportation doesn't even have its rulemaking in place around transportation. Nope. But somebody got that. I'm sorry, y'all. My lip is quivering. It is like sets me on fire to sit in meetings in DC and be engaged in these conversations around something that at its very heart is built off a premise of harm. And your paper tells you that this will be effective, but people's lived conditions say the opposite.
Thank you. All right, Warren, Brad, you ask
Yeah,
questions.
so out of curiosity, well, first I know that partnerships are very important, especially working with entities that already have systems in place that can disperse resources very broadly, even though the system might not be perfect. in some cases, it might be easier to try to improve the system that exists rather than build one from scratch. But have you ever dealt with a sticky situation where you just read the writing on the wall and you see you're going to have to advocate for money that's being allocated to one entity and advocate for that to be allocated somewhere else where it might be better spent? And I guess like an example that I remember you bringing up is LIHEAP, the Direct Cash Assistance Program. And in comparison to LIHEAP's budget, WAP's is just egregiously small.
Right.
Arguably, that gets to the root of the issue, which is like the actual energy system being used and the insulation and the appliances, which can lead to lower energy burdens in the long run, rather than just giving direct cash assistance, which, half the time the people who do qualify don't even get access to because it's not necessarily an entitlement. So what do you do in a situation where you don't want to burn any bridges, but at the same time, you want to advocate for the people who need that money perhaps elsewhere?
So are you talking about like reallocating it at the federal level, or like having it come?
That's just an example, just any level where maybe you see money might be better spent somewhere else, but at the same time, you don't want maybe the people or the program that is receiving that type of money to feel slighted or take it personally. You know what I mean?
Right.
Is that ever a situation or like a sensitive, politic that you come across?
Defense spending? I don't really have an example of something that we've worked on where we tried to see a reallocation of the dollars. Actually, we've thought about how to do that with some of the appropriation around like hydrogen and CCS. Could we get that reallocated? But that's legislative. The budgets are legislative, so in order to undo that, it has to be a legislative process, which means the advocacy would be to have a reduction in that particular line item in the next budget, and you could advocate to have an increase in a line item someplace else. And then once it leaves, so like if we use LIHEAP or even WAP as an example, in theory, the states have to use that money in the way that it was designed. And so even for a state to use it for a different purpose would make them out of compliance. Now, if the federal government would actually pursue that, I'm not sure, but probably not. Because we think about that a lot with like Title VI. Like if you aren't using the money in the right way, or if there is a discriminatory element to it, you should be able to ask for the money back. But it's been, I think, housing or HUD, and this might be years ago, might be the only example of where the federal government actually did that. But I don't think I'm answering your question well. I just think it's a legislative process.
Yeah, maybe advocating for more investment from, it could be the federal government level, state, depending on what program you're looking at. Maybe just advocating more so for more investment in one, and maybe reassessing the amount of investment in another. Not so much,
Right.
just
Right.
going completely off the rails and like forget the budget rules.
Right. Yeah, so I will say to you, other dollars. The reason why our team grew was because we were in a moment where environmental justice was centered and people felt more comfortable giving money to larger, predominantly white-led entities that they felt like had more of a track record than we did. And I just refused to support anyone in getting a $20 million budget for you to re-grant $25,000 to me. Like that just didn't sit well with me. I figured let's go for the 20 million ourselves. And we haven't gotten to it, but like that's my way of thinking about it.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Oh.